Hello, I'm Alex Coffel, and my presentation is the Ableism Experienced by People with Invisible Disabilities, a Comparative Autoethnography. I am currently attending CWU as a post-baccalaureate, majoring in Deaf and Sign Language Studies and minoring in Accessibility Studies. My previous degree is in anthropology. I am physically disabled and often need mobility aids such as a cane or mobility scooter, but sometimes I don't use them, making my disability invisible. My variable needs and experiences with ableism are what drove me to research this topic. This presentation was developed for Source 2023 and concerns the ableism and everyday interactions faced by people with physical disabilities. Everyday interactions here means social contact with strangers or acquaintances in non-medical, educational, or workplace settings. This project aims to identify the causes behind ableism and how it manifests. My goals for this presentation are to generate awareness of ableism, especially against people with invisible disabilities, and to provide a greater understanding of how ableism manifests and the attitudes behind it. My hope is that this can function as a guide for understanding prejudice that the disability community and its allies can use to better combat ableism when it happens. Here is some important terminology that appears in this presentation. An invisible disability is one that is not immediately apparent to an outside observer. There are many reasons a disability may be considered invisible, such as personal choice, lack of access to medical equipment, or low support needs. Ableism is prejudice and discrimination on the basis of disability status. Finally, stigma is a widespread negative belief about a group of people and is the basis for all discrimination and prejudice, not just ableism. Studies have identified 3 different types of prejudice: hostile, which is overt and sometimes violent; benevolent, which associates a group with desirable traits in order to make them acceptable targets; and ambivalent, which is a combination of hostile and benevolent. It is important to keep in mind that not all prejudice appears hateful on the surface, and may even appear positive or neutral if one doesn't understand the beliefs behind such instances of prejudice. The stereotype content model is a method of understanding ambivalent prejudice and predicting the discrimination that a marginalized group might face based on the quadrant they belong to. This is arranged based on whether society as a whole views a stigmatized group as having lower or higher status and whether they are competitive threats. In other words, does this group have less power than me, or is their social power equal to or greater than mine? And does this group compete for resources that I perceive as valuable and limited, such as jobs or social support? Each quadrant includes the general feelings associated with a group, the behaviors caused by those feelings, example groups, and alternative titles. In this template, people with disabilities are in the legitimate dependence quadrant, although the authors argue that they can potentially fit into any quadrant except reference in groups, which requires further study. Explanatory legitimacy theory is designed to understand individual instances of prejudice and argues that identity is context-dependent. The 3 elements of explanatory legitimacy theory are description, explanation, and legitimacy. Description is how a person looks and behaves. If someone's description is atypical, the explanation provides a reason why. Based on the explanation, a person is labeled as legitimate or illegitimate. If you are not familiar with identity theory, this may seem confusing. All you need to know for this presentation is that ableism is not based on someone's actual disability status or identity. I personally identify as disabled, but every individual I interact with determines if that identity is legitimate or not based on their own perceptions. Based on studies that interview people with disability about the ableism they experience, people with visible disabilities describe being excluded from events, being treated as a burden, and losing friendships. Few studies have been done on the ableism people with invisible disabilities face in everyday situations, but some have described being encouraged to overcome their disability, feeling watched and judged, and having their privacy violated. Both groups describe being accused of faking their disability. As I mentioned, there's been very little research on prejudice against people with invisible disabilities. Research that has been conducted focuses either on arguing that invisible disabilities exist at all, or on documenting medical and employment discrimination. I have chosen to format this project as an autoethnography. Ethnography and autoethnography are established methods in social sciences like anthropology and involve observing or participating in a culture with the goal of understanding it. For this project, my own experiences with ableism are the data that will answer the research question: how does ableism manifest for people with invisible physical disabilities, and how does it compare to ableism experienced by people with visible physical disabilities? I kept a journal of ableist experiences that occurred between the time of being diagnosed with my disability and the start of this project. I then grouped similar experiences by outcome instead of listing every specific situation in order to more easily identify trends. Each experience was then sorted into one of the quadrants of the stereotype content model and assigned judgment based on explanatory legitimacy theory. These are the tables I used to visualize the data. Here are the common experiences I recorded. Feel free to pause to read them or download the PowerPoint for alt text. Note that experiences related to my disability being invisible are labeled with a letter, while those related to my disability being visible are labeled with a number. The first quadrant, illegitimate dependents, is the low status, high competition section and is defined by beliefs that that group are lazy, burdens, or freeloaders. Categorization was not dependent on visibility, and as the name suggests, the judgment for all experiences in this quadrant was illegitimate. Next is legitimate dependence, the low status, low competition quadrant, associated with pity and infantilization. Only experiences while visibly disabled fell into this section, and again, as the name suggests, the judgment was legitimate across the board. Next is the reference in-group section, identified by high status but low competition. This is where the perpetrator of prejudice assumes that they are interacting with an ally rather than a target. As such, the only experiences that fit here were ones associated with invisibility. The last group is aspirational, or high status and high competition. This is where the majority group wants what the minority group has, in this case accommodations and monetary compensation, and that envy is the driving force of prejudice. Only ableism experienced while my disability was visible fit here, but interestingly, judgments for experiences in both quadrants were mixed. There was much more overlap between the categories than I expected. A majority of experiences from both sides, visible and invisible, fit into the illegitimate dependence quadrant of the stereotype content model and were judged as illegitimate. However, an illegitimate judgment was not a requirement for ableism to manifest as I initially expected. There was even one experience where ableism was based on a legitimate judgment while my disability was invisible, which does not seem to be an experience that is widely recorded among existing literature. Additionally, having an invisible disability does not protect people from experiencing ableism second or first-hand. Finally, because ableism can fall into any one of the four quadrants of the stereotype content model, and therefore has multiple stigmas supporting it, it is much more difficult to address it at the source than if it only fit into one. I hope that my research can be used as a basis for larger studies involving more points of view, including studies focused on disabilities other than physical, and how ableism fits into the reference in-groups quadrant. The first step in defeating ignorance is education, and to that end, understanding the roots of ableism can help in the fight against it. Going into this project, I had concerns about both the focus and my method. Given the lack of social awareness for invisible disabilities, I didn't know if an autoethnography on the topic would be worth pursuing or if it would be taken seriously. As I developed the project further, I realized its significance. It is so important for research into communities and cultures to involve, if not be led by, people who are part of those communities and cultures. It is time to shift the focus on research involving invisible disability. We know we exist. What questions should we be asking instead? I will be receiving my certificate in accessibility studies this quarter and have no plans to pursue the program or this project further. However, I am open to the idea of doing so in the future and would be happy to be involved in any research further exploring this topic. I will also continue advocating for the disability community. Thank you for your time.